Mini Test 13. Passage 1. Listen to part of a lecture in a geology class.
In geologic terms, lakes are temporary phenomena. I don't care how big the lake is or how long it's been there. On a geologic scale, it is always destined to rather quickly disappear. There have been many big lakes in the geologic history of the U.S. that no longer exist. Today, I would like to talk about one of them. I'd like to talk about Lake Bonneville. Now, Lake Bonneville was one of those many lakes formed by the melting of the great ice sheets at the end of the ice ages. This happened about 32,000 years ago. In geologic terms, that's yesterday. Lake Bonneville was huge, taking up most of Utah and parts of Nevada and Idaho. It appears to have been a terminal lake. By this, I mean that it had no outlets. Although most terminal lakes are generally salt lakes, it seems that, at this point at least, Lake Bonneville was large enough to be pretty much composed of fresh water. How do we know? Well, we found evidence of the kind of fish that were living in it and the kinds of animals that must have relied on it for water. These fish and animals could not have survived by living in or drinking salt water. If you go to Utah today, you can still see the shorelines of the ancient lake. These show up as flat areas on what are otherwise rather steep hillsides. These shorelines formed whenever the elevation of the lake remained stable for long periods of time. If you go to many of these old shorelines, you can even find evidence of the ancient peoples who lived on them. A lot of arrowheads and that kind of thing have been found on these old shorelines. Clearly, Lake Bonneville was an important factor in the lives of many early Native Americans. But this is a little bit misleading, because by the time the first Native Americans arrived, we no longer refer to the lake as Lake Bonneville, but as the Great Salt Lake. You see, they are really one and the same. The Great Salt Lake is simply one of the remnant lakes of the ancient Lake Bonneville. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Anyway, 32,000 years ago, we had this huge freshwater lake, and by 10,000 years ago, it had become a much smaller salt lake. So what happened to it? Well, to understand this, you have to understand that the size of any terminal lake is highly dependent on the amount of precipitation in the surrounding area. As a result, these lakes have the ability to change size rather quickly. It appears that sometime around 16,800 years ago, there must have been a period of increased precipitation because the level of the lake rose to a point where it was at the level of a place known as Red Rock Pass. This can be thought of as the lowest part of the dam that kept the lake from overflowing. But the lake continued to rise until it began overflowing at this pass and eventually broke through this dam entirely. This must have caused one of history's greatest floods. The flood itself is believed to have continued for about a year, and the lake's elevation fell by about 375 feet and released 1,000 cubic miles of water, which flowed northwards into what is now the Snake River. Much of the landscape, the canyons and such of this area of the West were created by this great flood. Now, for about 1,000 years after this event, things kind of stabilized. Water still flowed out through Red Rock Pass, but at a low and continuous level. But eventually the lake's level fell and the lake once again became a terminal lake. The level continued to fall for about 2,500 years, but then rose about 10,000 years ago to form something called the Gilbert Shoreline. As I mentioned previously, this is around the time the first Native Americans came to the area. It also marks the last stage of Lake Bonneville and the first stage of the Great Salt Lake. Cut off and with no real input of fresh water, the waters of the lake evaporated, becoming more and more salty with each passing year. Even though the Great Salt Lake is now the biggest lake in the western U.S., it is really tiny when compared to Lake Bonneville. Now, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, all lakes are temporary phenomena. So what will be the future of the Great Salt Lake? Your guess is as good as mine. It all depends on the climate. It could very well just evaporate away. Then again, increases in precipitation may cause the level to rise and make the size of the lake increase. Sure, all lakes are destined to disappear, but whether this will be in hundreds or thousands of years is just impossible to say.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. What is the lecture mainly about? 2. Which of the following is true of terminal lakes? 3. What evidence shows that Lake Bonneville's level stabilized? 4. How does the professor emphasize the size of the Lake Bonneville flood? 5. In the lecture, the professor describes the history of Lake Bonneville. Put the events of this history in the correct order. Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Now, Lake Bonneville was one of those many lakes formed by the melting of the great ice sheets at the end of the ice ages. This happened about 32,000 years ago. In geologic terms, that's yesterday.
6. What does the professor mean when she says this?
In geologic terms, that's yesterday.